abuser! You child abuser! You child abuser! Where's Jimmy Savile? Where's Jimmy Savile? Traitor! You child abuser!
The most explosive political showdown in modern British history is happening right now. Keir Starmer's government is crumbling, Nigel Farage is smiling, and the entire UK political system is about to be turned upside down. What started as whispers in Westminster has exploded into a full-scale war between two men who couldn't be more different. But the story of why these citizens are shouting towards Starmer is actually shocking. Just days ago, Keir Starmer stood before a packed meeting of Labour MPs and delivered what many are calling the most desperate speech of his career. His target, Nigel Farage. His weapon, name-calling. Starmer branded the Reform UK leader a plastic patriot, hoping to damage his rival's credibility with voters who see Farage as the voice of forgotten Britain. The attack was personal, it was brutal, and it backfired spectacularly. Farage's response came within hours, and it was devastating. Speaking to millions of viewers across the country, he dismissed Starmer's attacks as nothing more than gutter politics from a failing leader who had run out of ideas. He accused Labour of resorting to personal abuse because they couldn't defend their record on the issues that mattered most to ordinary people. But Farage wasn't finished. His counterattack went straight for Starmer's biggest weakness. While Starmer was busy hurling insults, Farage was highlighting the government's failures. Immigration numbers had soared to record levels under Labour's watch. The economy was stagnating. Taxes were rising. Working families were struggling more than ever. And what was the Prime Minister's response? Name-calling and personal attacks instead of solutions. The British public was watching, and they didn't like what they saw. Within 48 hours of Starmer's plastic patriot jibe, something extraordinary happened. Reform UK's membership surged by over 15,000 new members. Donations flooded in from supporters who were disgusted by what they saw as Starmer's desperate attempt to smear his political opponents. The party's social media following exploded, with videos of Farage's response going viral across every platform. But the real bombshell was yet to come. Polling data released just days after the confrontation showed a political earthquake in progress. Labour's support had collapsed to just 27%, while Reform UK had surged to 23%, within striking distance of becoming the official opposition. In constituency after constituency across the north of England, traditional Labour heartlands were abandoning Starmer in droves. The plastic patriot attack hadn't damaged Farage, it had destroyed Starmer's credibility. Inside Westminster, panic was setting in. Labour MPs were furious that their leader had handed Farage such a perfect opportunity to portray himself as the victim of establishment bullying. One MP confided to journalists that the party was living through its worst crisis in decades, explaining that every time Starmer attacked Farage, it only made the Reform leader look more like the underdog fighting against a corrupt system. But the crisis inside Labour was about to get much worse. Angela Rayner's resignation had already sent shockwaves through the party, but the revelation that she had deliberately concealed a £40,000 tax scandal while serving as Deputy Prime Minister was the final straw for many MPs. The woman, who had spent years attacking the rich for not paying their fair share, had been caught doing exactly the same thing herself. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, and Farage wasted no time in exploiting it. At rally after rally, he hammered home the same message. Labour talks about fairness and equality, but their own leaders live by different rules. They demand higher taxes from working families while their own deputy avoids paying what she owes. Meanwhile, Peter Mandelson's humiliating dismissal as US ambassador had handed Farage another perfect weapon. The revelation that Mandelson had close ties to Jeffrey Epstein was political dynamite. Farage accused Labour of being so out of touch with ordinary decency that they couldn't even recognize a scandal when it was staring them in the face. But while Starmer's world was falling apart, Farage was experiencing a political renaissance unlike anything in recent British history. At Reform UK's annual conference, the atmosphere was electric. Thousands of supporters packed the venue, waving flags and cheering every word from their leader. This was a movement. People who had felt ignored and abandoned by the political establishment had found their champion. Farage's speech that day was masterful. He painted a picture of two Britons, one ruled by an out-of-touch elite who lived in their Westminster bubble, and another made up of ordinary working people who just wanted their voices heard. He promised to tear down the system that had failed them and build something better in its place. The crowd roared its approval, but it was what happened next that truly showed the scale of the political earthquake taking place. Within hours of Farage's conference speech, Reform UK's poll numbers jumped another 3 points. The party was now polling at 26%, just 1 point behind the Conservative Party and breathing down Labour's neck. In some constituencies, particularly in the north of England, Reform was already ahead of both major parties. Political commentators were struggling to comprehend what they were witnessing. A party that had just 5 MPs was now on the verge of becoming the most popular political movement in the country. But the most devastating blow to Starmer's leadership was still to come. Internal polling, conducted by Labour's own strategists, revealed the true scale of the disaster facing the party. In focus groups across the country, former Labour voters were explaining why they had switched to Reform. They talked about feeling betrayed by a government that promised change but delivered more of the same. Most damaging of all, they described Starmer himself as weak, out of touch, and fundamentally dishonest. The plastic patriot attack had reinforced every negative stereotype about establishment politicians looking down on ordinary people who dared to challenge the status quo. Farage seized on the revelations with glee. He declared that Labour's own research proved what he had been saying all along, that the British people were sick of being talked down to by politicians who had never lived in the real world. But perhaps the most significant development was happening behind the scenes in constituencies across the country. Local Labour parties were in open revolt. Emergency meetings were being called to discuss votes of no confidence in Starmer's leadership. Long-standing members were tearing up their membership cards and walking out. Activists who had campaigned for Labour for decades were switching sides, joining Reform UK and bringing their local knowledge and contacts with them. The defections were practical disasters for Labour's electoral machine. These were the people who delivered leaflets, knocked on doors, and got voters to the polls. Without them, Labour's ability to compete in elections would be severely compromised. Farage understood the significance of what was happening. He started targeting Labour's traditional strongholds with surgical precision, holding rallies in towns and cities that had voted Labour for generations. His message was tailored perfectly to local concerns, promising to bring back industry to former mining communities and to control immigration in areas struggling with rapid demographic change. The response was overwhelming. Venues that Labour had struggled to fill were packed to capacity for Farage's events. Local newspapers that had traditionally supported Labour began running positive coverage of Reform UK's policies. But the final nail in Starmer's political coffin came from an unexpected source. Trade union leaders, traditionally Labour's most reliable allies, began issuing public warnings about the party's direction. Unite the Union, one of Labour's biggest financial backers, released a statement saying they could not continue supporting a party that seemed more interested in fighting culture wars than defending working-class interests. Without union backing, Labour's finances would collapse, making it impossible to fund election campaigns or maintain their political infrastructure. Farage spotted the opportunity immediately. He began reaching out directly to union members, bypassing their leadership, and speaking to rank-and-file workers who felt abandoned by both their unions and the Labour Party. His message was simple. Reform UK would put British workers first, not the global corporations that seemed to have captured both Labour and Conservative politicians. Meanwhile, in Westminster, pressure on Starmer was becoming unbearable. Cabinet ministers were briefing against each other. MPs were refusing to defend. Government policy on television and the Prime Minister's own approval ratings had collapsed to levels not seen since the final days of Liz Truss. Farage was quick to highlight the parallels with Truss. He pointed out that she, for all her faults, at least tried to implement policies she believed in. Starmer, by contrast, seemed to stand for nothing except staying in power. His attacks on Reform UK, Farage argued, were the desperate flailing of a man who knew he had nothing positive to offer the British people. As the political crisis deepened, whispers began circulating in Westminster about a possible leadership challenge. Senior Labour figures were holding private meetings to discuss whether the party could survive with Starmer at the helm. But even a change of leadership might not be enough to save Labour from the political tsunami that Farage had unleashed. Reform UK was no longer just a protest vote. It was a genuine alternative government in waiting with policies that appealed to millions of voters who felt abandoned by the traditional parties. The question was no longer whether Starmer would survive as Prime Minister. The question was whether the Labour Party itself could survive the political revolution that was sweeping across Britain. And at the center of that revolution, smiling confidently as his opponents tore themselves apart, stood Nigel Farage, the man who had finally broken the British political establishment.